The apartment feels smaller at night. That's something I've learned after all these years of living alone. The walls press closer when the sun goes down, and the silence becomes something you can almost touch. I sit on the couch I bought 3 years ago, practical gray fabric that hides stains well, and stare at the phone glowing on my coffee table. The message came in 27 minutes ago. I know because I've been watching the timestamp change. Do you remember that night? For words that have turned my evening into something unrecognizable. My thumb hovers over the screen, trembling slightly, as if those letters might burn me. Around me, everything is exactly where I left it this morning. Books stacked in perfect rows on the shelves, spines aligned like soldiers. The framed photographs on the mantel show carefully chosen moments. My college graduation, a hiking trip with colleagues, my parents at their anniversary dinner. Safe memories. Acceptable ones. None of them tell the whole story of who I am. But there's another photograph. One I keep on the bottom shelf, pushed behind my copy of Leaves of Grass and a cookbook I've never opened. My fingers find it now, pulling it free from its hiding place. The edges are soft with age, worn from the times I've held it when the loneliness became too much to bear. Two young men look back at me from 17 years ago. We're laughing at something beyond the camera's reach, our arms thrown around each other's shoulders with the easy intimacy of best friends. But even in this faded image, there's something else. The way we're leaning into each other, the way his hand rests against my chest, fingers spread wide. Too close for friendship, too careful to be accidental. I trace his face with my fingertip, the sharp jawline, the eyes that always seem to see too much. Julian. I whisper his name aloud for the first time in years, and it feels like breaking a spell I cast on myself long ago. The sound echoes in my small living room, hollow and strange. The phone buzzes again. Another message. My heart stops, then starts again too fast. But it's just a notification about a bill that's due, and I feel foolish for hoping it might be him again, for fearing it might be him again. I set the photograph on the coffee table next to my phone, two artifacts from different versions of my life. The ache in my chest isn't new. I've carried it for so long it's become part of me, like a scar that never quite heals. But tonight it feels sharper, more insistent. Tonight it has a voice, and that voice is asking if I remember. Of course I remember. That's the problem. That's always been the problem. I set the photograph face down and walk to the kitchen, though I'm not hungry. The ritual of making tea gives my hands something to do while my mind wanders backward, away from Julian's message and into the life I've carefully constructed over the past 15 years. I am 34 years old, and most days I feel exactly that age. Not young enough for reckless mistakes, not old enough for true wisdom. I teach English at Millbrook High School, the same building where I once sat in back rows and wrote poetry in the margins of my textbooks. The irony isn't lost on me. I've become the kind of teacher I would have trusted with my secrets, though I keep my own locked away. My colleagues know me as reliable. I arrive early, stay late, and never miss a faculty meeting. When they gather in the break room to share weekend stories, I listen more than I speak. They know I live alone, that I read voraciously, that I once spent an entire summer vacation cataloging rare books for the county library. What they don't know is why I've never brought anyone to the Christmas parties, why I change the subject when conversations turn to dating, why I sometimes catch myself staring too long when David from the math department laughs at something. My apartment reflects this careful balance between visibility and privacy. 2 bedrooms, though I use the second one as an office. A kitchen with a small table where I eat dinner while grading papers. Everything clean, everything in its place. The furniture came from sensible stores, Target, IKEA, places where you can build a life without making too many statements about who you are. But there are clues, if someone knew how to look. The poetry collection tucked between my teaching manuals. A subscription to a literary magazine that publishes stories about people like me, though I'd never admit that's why I read it. And on my nightstand, beneath the lamp I bought because it reminded me of one I'd seen in a bookshop years ago, sits a thin volume of Adrian Rich poems. Hidden between pages 73 and 74 is a note, written in handwriting I recognized instantly even after all these years. The paper is soft now, nearly transparent where it's been folded and unfolded countless times. Someday, tell me what it feels like. Julian wrote that during our senior year of high school, passed it to me during chemistry class when Mrs. Henderson wasn't looking. I'd asked him what he meant, but he just smiled and looked away, and somehow I understood that the answer was something I'd have to discover on my own. I kept it because it felt like a promise, though I was never sure if it was a promise he was making to me or one I was making to myself. The weekends are the hardest. Saturday mornings I drive to the grocery store, buy exactly what I need for the week ahead. The cashiers know me now, the quiet man who shops alone, who always brings his own bags, who says thank you but never lingers for conversation. Sometimes I see former students with their families, young people I once taught who are now building the kinds of lives I watch from a distance. Sundays I visit my parents. They live 20 minutes away, in the house where I grew up, where my bedroom still contains remnants of the boy I used to be. My mother always asks the same questions. Am I eating enough? Am I getting enough sleep? Have I met anyone special? The last question comes with a particular weight, a hopefulness that makes my chest tight. I give her the same answers I've been giving for years. I'm fine. I'm focused on work. I'm not looking for anything serious right now. My father nods along, but sometimes I catch him watching me with an expression I can't quite read. Disappointment, maybe, or recognition. He was 40 when he married my mother, older than I am now. Maybe he understands something about waiting, about the space between wanting and having. They've stopped asking directly, but the questions hang in the air anyway. When will I settle down? When will I give them grandchildren? When will I stop being whatever it is I am and become what they need me to be? I lie by omission every Sunday, sitting at their kitchen table, eating my mother's pot roast, pretending that the life I'm living is the life I chose rather than the one I defaulted into when I couldn't figure out how to be honest. They love me, I know that, but they love a version of me that requires constant maintenance, careful editing of stories and experiences. During the week, I lose myself in lesson plans and student essays. I teach Whitman and Dickinson, Shakespeare and Morrison. I help 17-year-olds find their voices, learn to articulate the things that matter to them. Sometimes, reading their poems about first love and heartbreak, I feel like a fraud. How can I teach them to be brave with their words when I've spent my adult life practicing careful silence? But then there are moments, rare ones, when a student writes something that cuts straight to the truth, something raw and honest and unafraid. Those are the papers I grade last, alone at my kitchen table, when the apartment is dark except for one lamp. Those are the nights I allow myself to remember what it felt like to be young and full of possibility, before I learned that some possibilities come with prices too high to pay. Tonight is one of those nights. Julian's message has broken something open in me, some carefully maintained distance between who I am and who I've been pretending to be. I pulled a note from the poetry book, unfolded it with shaking fingers, and read his words again. Someday, tell me what it feels like. After all these years of wondering, maybe someday has finally arrived. 3 days pass before I find the courage to respond to Julian's message. 3 days of carrying my phone everywhere, checking it obsessively, drafting replies I never sent. I start with casual responses, sure, that sounds nice, then delete them. I try honesty. I've thought about you every day for 17 years, then delete that too. In the end, I settle for something that feels both truthful and safe. I'd like that. His response comes within minutes, as if he'd been waiting by his phone the way I'd been waiting by mine. Friday evening, 7 o'clock, Murphy's Tavern on Main Street. Do you remember it? Of course I remember it. Murphy's is where we used to go after football games our senior year, crowding into the back booth with the rest of our friends, sharing baskets of fries and talking about everything except the things that mattered most. It's where Julian once leaned close to me, close enough that I could smell his cologne, and asked me a question that changed the trajectory of my life. Why do you like guys? He said it so quietly, I almost didn't hear him over the jukebox playing some forgotten song from 1987. Our friends were distracted, arguing about whether our quarterback had what it took to get a scholarship. Julian's eyes were serious, curious, without judgment, but full of something I couldn't name at the time. I remember the way my heart stopped, then started again too fast. I remember looking around to make sure no one else had heard, then looking back at him and seeing something in his expression that made me brave enough to tell the truth. I don't know, I whispered back. I just do. The same way you like girls, I guess. But Julian didn't nod the way I expected him to. Instead, he kept staring at me with those dark eyes, as if he was trying to solve a puzzle. Then he said something that haunted me for years afterward. What if it's not the same at all? That conversation happened on a Thursday in November, 2 weeks before Thanksgiving break. I know because I wrote about it in my journal that night, pages and pages trying to decode what he meant, what he was really asking. The next day at school, he acted like nothing had happened. We fell back into our familiar rhythm of shared jokes and easy companionship, but something had shifted. There was a new kind of awareness between us, a tension that felt both thrilling and dangerous. Now, 17 years later, I'm supposed to meet him at the same place where that conversation began. The symmetry feels intentional, though I can't tell if it's his doing or just the universe's sense of irony. The timing couldn't be worse, or perhaps it couldn't be better. Last Sunday's dinner with my parents was particularly difficult. My mother had spent the entire meal talking about the Henderson's son, who'd recently gotten engaged to a lovely girl from the next town over. She spoke with the kind of wistful enthusiasm that I'd learned to recognize as pointed. "When are you going to find someone nice, Nathaniel?" she asked as I helped her clear the dishes. "You're not getting any younger." My father, folding his napkin with the precise movements that characterized everything he did, added his own gentle pressure. "Your mother worries about you being alone. We both do." I gave them my standard responses about being focused on my career, about not having met the right person yet. But sitting there in their kitchen, surrounded by family photos that chronicled a life of conventional milestones I'd never reach, I felt the weight of their expectations like a physical thing pressing down on my chest. What made it worse was that part of me wanted to give them what they needed. Part of me had spent years trying to feel something real for the women I'd dated sporadically: Sarah from the library, Michelle who taught 3rd grade, Lisa who worked at the bank and had kind eyes and a patient smile. I'd taken them to dinner, held their hands during movies, even kissed them goodnight on doorsteps, hoping that somewhere in the performance I might discover an authentic feeling. But there was always a distance, a sense that I was playing a role rather than living a life. They deserved better than someone going through the motions, and eventually, they all seemed to sense that something essential was missing. So I stopped trying. I told myself it was easier this way, that I'd rather be alone than be dishonest. But the truth was more complicated. I wasn't just alone, I was waiting for something I couldn't name, for someone who would make sense of all the feelings I'd been carrying around like unopened letters. And now Julian has resurfaced, married with children, living a life I can only imagine from the outside. His social media profile, which I'd searched for immediately after receiving his message, shows carefully curated glimpses of suburban contentment. Photos of birthday parties and little league games, family vacations to beaches where everyone is smiling and tan. His wife is pretty in an uncomplicated way, with blonde hair and the kind of easy confidence that comes from never having to question whether you belong in your own life. I study these images like artifacts from a foreign culture, trying to reconcile them with the Julian I once knew. The boy who asked difficult questions and looked at me as if I held answers he desperately needed. The boy who once said, during one of our late-night phone conversations, "I wish I could see the world the way you do, Nathaniel. You notice things other people miss." What did he see in me that made him curious enough to ask that question at Murphy's Tavern? What made him save my phone number all these years, find me on social media, reach out now when his life seems so settled and complete? I want to believe it's the same thing that made me keep his note pressed between the pages of poetry, the same thing that made me whisper his name in my empty apartment 3 nights ago. But I'm afraid to hope for that much honesty, that much risk. Friday approaches with the weight of inevitability. I changed my mind about meeting him a dozen times, draft excuses and cancellations I never sent. But Thursday evening, grading essays about courage and cowardice in To Kill a Mockingbird, I realize I've been teaching lessons I'm not brave enough to follow myself. So I send one final message. See you tomorrow. His response is immediate, just one word that somehow contains multitudes of possibility. Yes. Friday evening arrives with the kind of autumn chill that makes you aware of your breathing. I stand outside Murphy's Tavern for 5 minutes before going in, watching other people move past the windows, couples sharing appetizers, groups of friends celebrating the end of the work week. Normal people living normal lives, unburdened by the weight of 17-year-old questions finally demanding answers. When I finally push through the door, I see him immediately. Julian sits in a corner booth, not the back one where we used to gather with our friends, but close enough that the memories feel intentional. He's changed, of course, broader shoulders, lines around his eyes, hair shorter and more conservative than the shaggy style he wore in high school. But when he looks up and sees me, his smile is exactly the same. That slightly crooked grin that used to make my stomach flutter during chemistry class. The first hour passes in careful choreography. We order drinks, beer for him, wine for me, and trade the basic statistics of adult life. He tells me about his job in marketing, his house in the suburbs of Chicago, his commute and his mortgage, and the way his daughter lost her first tooth last month. I tell him about teaching, about the small victories and daily challenges of shaping young minds, about the satisfaction of seeing former students succeed. We're like actors who've forgotten our lines, falling back on the safe scripts of polite conversation. But beneath the surface pleasantries, I can feel the current of something else. The way his eyes linger on my face when he thinks I'm not looking. The way my pulse quickens when he laughs at something I say. The way both of us seem to be waiting for permission to acknowledge what we're really doing here. It's Julian who finally breaks the careful distance between past and present. He's halfway through telling me about his son's soccer league when he stops mid-sentence, shakes his head, and says something that cuts straight through the pretense. This is ridiculous, isn't it? We're talking like strangers. I take a sip of wine, buying myself time to find the right words. We're not strangers, but we're not who we used to be either. No, he agrees, leaning back against the booth's worn vinyl. But maybe that's not entirely a bad thing. He asks if I remember our senior year, and suddenly we're 17 again, sharing stories about teachers and classmates, laughing about the time we got detention for passing notes during Mr. Peterson's history lectures. But even our reminiscing feels different now, filtered through the perspective of men who understand that high school wasn't just practice for real life, it was real life, with consequences that rippled forward into everything that came after. Do you ever think about that night? Julian asks, and I know instantly which night he means. The one I've replayed in my mind thousands of times, the one that divided my life into before and after. It was late November, 2 weeks after that conversation at Murphy's where he'd asked me about liking guys. I'd been lying awake thinking about his question, what if it's not the same at all, when my phone rang. Julian's voice was different, uncertain in a way that made me sit up in bed. Can I come over? He asked. I need to talk to someone, and you're the only person who would understand. My parents were asleep, but Julian knew how to climb through my bedroom window. We'd perfected the technique during countless nights of teenage rebellion. He arrived within 15 minutes, still wearing the clothes from our basketball game earlier that evening, his hair damp from the shower he'd taken afterward. He sat on the edge of my bed, nervous in a way I'd never seen him before. For a long time, he didn't say anything, just stared at his hands while I waited for him to explain why he'd needed to see me so urgently. Finally, he looked up, and in the dim light from my desk lamp, his eyes were searching. I've been thinking about what you said, about how you just know you like guys the same way I know I like girls. I remember nodding, afraid that speaking might break whatever spell had brought him to my room in the middle of the night. But what if I don't know? He continued. What if I don't know anything at all? The vulnerability in his voice was so raw it made my chest ache. I wanted to reach out to him, but I didn't know if comfort was what he was asking for, or if there was something else he needed from me. Show me, he said finally, so quietly I almost didn't hear him. Hold me, just once, so I'll understand what it feels like. Even now, 17 years later, sitting across from him in this tavern, I can remember the exact quality of silence that followed his request. The way my heart hammered against my ribs. The way the space between us seemed to pulse with possibility and danger. I had never held another boy before, never wanted to as much as I wanted to hold Julian in that moment. But I was also terrified of doing it wrong, of wanting it too much, of giving away feelings I'd spent months learning to hide. But Julian was looking at me with such desperate curiosity, such trust, that I found myself moving toward him. I remember how carefully I positioned my arms around his shoulders, how he leaned into me with a sigh that sounded like relief. We sat like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, his head resting against my chest, my chin touching the top of his hair. He fit against me perfectly, as if we'd been designed for this exact configuration. I could feel his heartbeat through his thin t-shirt, could smell the lingering scent of his shampoo. Every part of my body was hyper-aware of every part of his. The warmth of his skin, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way his hand eventually came to rest against my arm, fingers curling slightly, as if he was holding on. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say that wouldn't have shattered the fragile perfection of the moment. But I knew, even then, that I was falling in love with the weight of him against me, with the trust he was showing by letting me hold him, with the way he seemed to melt into my embrace as if he belonged there. When he finally pulled away, his eyes were bright with something I couldn't name. "Thank you," he whispered. "Now I understand." But he didn't tell me what he understood, and I was too afraid to ask. Now, sitting in Murphy's Tavern, Julian reaches across the table and touches my hand briefly. His wedding ring catches the light, a small gold reminder of the life he chose, the path he followed after that night in my bedroom. "I remember everything," he says. "Do you?" I nod, not trusting my voice. "I used to think it was just curiosity," he continues, "just trying to understand something foreign. But I've thought about that night for 17 years, Nathaniel. I've thought about the way you held me, the way it felt so." He trails off, searching for the right word. "Right," I finish for him. "It felt right." "Yes," he says, his voice barely audible over the tavern's ambient noise. "It felt right." And that terrified me. He tells me about the weeks that followed, how he threw himself into dating girls with desperate intensity, as if he could erase the memory of my arms around him through sheer force of heterosexual activity. How he convinced himself that what happened between us was just experimentation, just the kind of thing teenage boys do when they're trying to figure themselves out. But it didn't work, did it? I ask, though I already know the answer from the way he's looking at me. No, he admits. It didn't work at all. The confession hangs between us like a bridge we're both afraid to cross. Around us, Murphy's Tavern continues its Friday night rhythm. Laughter and conversation, the clink of glasses, the comfortable sounds of people who know exactly who they are and what they want. But Julian and I sit in our bubble of shared memory. Two men in our 30s finally acknowledging what we were too young and too scared to name when we were 17. That holding him had been the most natural thing I'd ever done, and letting him go had been the hardest. We leave Murphy's Tavern around 9, the weight of our conversation making the crowded space feel suffocating. Julian suggests we walk, and I know he means toward the school. Some gravitational pull draws us back to the places where our story began, as if retracing those steps might help us understand how we ended up here. Two men in our 30s, finally brave enough to speak truths we buried as teenagers. The October air is crisp enough that our breath forms small clouds as we walk. Julian keeps his hands in his jacket pockets, but occasionally his shoulder brushes against mine, and each contact feels electric. We pass the drugstore where we used to buy candy before movies, the parking lot where we learned to drive in his father's old pickup truck, the corner where we'd wait for rides home after basketball practice. Everything looks smaller than I remember, the way childhood places always do. But the emotions feel bigger, amplified by years of suppression and the dangerous proximity of the person who inspired them. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Julian says as we turn onto School Street. "That night, when I asked you to hold me, I think about what would have happened if I hadn't pulled away." The admission stops me mid-step. We're under a street lamp now, and in the yellow light his face looks younger, more like the boy I fell in love with before I knew what love was. "I think about that too," I tell him honestly. "Every day for 17 years. He turns to face me fully, and I can see something raw in his expression, something that looks like the beginning of tears. I should have stayed, he says. I should have let you keep holding me. But you were scared. We were both scared. He kicks at a loose piece of concrete on the sidewalk. But I was scared of the wrong things, wasn't I? I was scared of what it meant that being in your arms felt like coming home. I was scared that if I stayed there any longer, I'd never want to leave. The confession hits me like a physical blow. All these years, I'd convinced myself that what happened between us had been one-sided, that I'd been the only one drowning in feelings too big and complicated to name. But Julian is standing here telling me he felt it too. The rightness, the belonging, the sense that we were two parts of something whole. We continue walking in silence, both of us processing what's been said. The high school appears ahead of us, a squat brick building that looks different in the darkness, but familiar enough to resurrect 1,000 memories. The parking lot where we'd eat lunch on warm days. The steps where I'd wait for him after his track practice. The gym where we'd watch basketball games and pretend we were paying attention to the score instead of to each other. Julian stops when we reach the main entrance, resting his hand against the brick wall. Do you remember junior prom? Of course I remember. Julian had gone with Sarah Mitchell, a sweet girl from our chemistry class who had harbored a crush on him for most of the year. I had gone alone, claiming I was too focused on academics to bother with dating, though the truth was that I couldn't imagine dancing with anyone when the only person I wanted to hold was already spoken for. I watched you that whole night, Julian says, his voice so quiet I have to strain to hear him. Sarah was lovely, and I tried so hard to focus on her. But every time I looked across the gym, there you were in that navy blue suit your mother picked out, looking so serious and handsome, and all I could think about was how much I wanted to cut in during the slow songs. The memory reshapes itself with this new information. I remember feeling invisible that night, watching Julian and Sarah move together during the slow dances while I made awkward conversation with chaperones and classmates' parents. I'd gone home early, claiming a headache, and spent the rest of the evening in my room, replaying the image of Julian's hands on Sarah's waist and wondering why it hurt so much to see him happy with someone else. I wanted to ask you to dance, I admit now. Just once. I knew it would never happen, but I wanted it so badly I could barely breathe. Julian's laugh is soft and sad. We were such cowards, weren't we? We were 17. We didn't know we were allowed to want what we wanted. He pushes off from the wall and starts walking again, heading toward the back of the school where the gymnasium stands. I follow him, my heart racing with the anticipation of whatever revelation is building between us. There's something else, he says when we reach the gym doors. Something I've never told anyone. The building is locked, of course, but Julian doesn't try the handles. Instead, he leans against the door frame and looks at me with an expression I recognize from that long-ago night in my bedroom. Vulnerable, desperate, terrified of his own honesty. That night when I climbed through your window, when I asked you to hold me. It wasn't really about understanding anything. I mean, it was, but not the way I said. I wait, afraid to breathe, afraid to break whatever spell is allowing him to finally tell me the truth. I already knew, he says. I'd known for months that I felt something for you that I didn't feel for anyone else. I'd lie awake thinking about you, wondering what your hands would feel like, what it would be like to fall asleep next to you. I was so confused and scared, and I didn't have anyone I could talk to about it. His words hit me like absolution and devastation all at once. All these years, I'd carried the guilt of wanting him, of taking advantage of his curiosity to fulfill my own desperate need for closeness. But he's telling me that the wanting wasn't one-sided, that the confusion and fear and overwhelming attraction had been mutual. So when I came to your room that night, I wasn't really asking you to show me what it felt like to hold another boy. I was asking you to hold me because I'd been dreaming about it for so long I couldn't stand it anymore. The parking lot spins around me. So when you said you understood afterward, I understood that I was in love with you. He says simply, I understood that everything I thought I knew about myself was wrong. And I understood that I was too much of a coward to do anything about it. We stand there in the shadow of our old high school, two men finally speaking the words our teenage selves were too frightened to say. The air between us feels charged with possibility and loss, with the weight of 17 years of silence finally broken. I was in love with you too, I tell him, and saying it aloud feels like letting go of a breath I've been holding for my entire adult life. Julian closes his eyes, and when he opens them again, there are tears. I know, he whispers. I think I always knew. And that's what made it so terrifying. The revelation settles between us like a bridge across time, connecting the boys we were to the men we've become. We loved each other. We were 17 and confused and scared, but we loved each other with the intensity that only teenagers can manage before the world teaches them to be careful with their hearts. The tragedy isn't that we were too young to understand what we felt. The tragedy is that we understood perfectly, and the world we lived in made us believe that understanding was something to be ashamed of rather than celebrated. I've spent 17 years wondering what would have happened if I'd been braver that night, Julian says. If I'd stayed in your arms instead of pulling away. If I'd told you the truth instead of pretending it was just curiosity. What would have happened? I ask, though I'm not sure I want to know the answer. He looks at me for a long moment, his expression full of tenderness and regret. I think we would have been different men, he says finally. I think we would have been the men we were supposed to be. We walk back to my apartment in a silence that feels different from the careful distance we maintained earlier. This quiet is heavy with possibility, weighted by the confessions we've just shared. Julian keeps pace beside me, closer now than he was on the way to the school, close enough that I can hear the rhythm of his breathing, feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cool night air. When we reach my building, I pause at the entrance, key in hand, suddenly uncertain about what comes next. For 17 years, Julian has existed in my imagination as a memory, a what-if, a beautiful ghost that haunted my quiet life. But now he's here, solid and real, looking at me with eyes that hold the same longing I've carried all these years. Can I come up? He asks, and the question carries more weight than simple hospitality. We both know that crossing this threshold will change something irrevocably. I nod and lead him upstairs, my hands trembling slightly as I unlock my apartment door. Inside, everything looks exactly as it did when I left for Murphy's Tavern 3 hours ago, but the space feels transformed by Julian's presence. He moves through my living room carefully, taking in the details of the life I've built without him. The books, the photographs, the careful arrangement of acceptable memories. He stops at my bookshelf, runs his finger along the spine of the poetry collection where I keep his note hidden. Without asking permission, he pulls it out, opens it to the exact page where the folded paper rests. His movements are so precise, so certain, that I realize he knows exactly what he's looking for. You kept it, he says, unfolding the note he wrote to me senior year. His handwriting looks younger somehow, full of the bold strokes of someone who believed the future held infinite possibilities. Of course I kept it. He reads his own words aloud. Someday, tell me what it feels like. When he looks up, his expression is soft with wonder and regret. I wrote this because I was too scared to ask you directly. I wanted to know what it felt like to be brave enough to want what you wanted. You were brave enough, I tell him. You came to my room that night. You let me hold you. But I ran away afterward. He sets the note carefully on my coffee table, next to the photograph I'd pulled out earlier. 2 artifacts from our shared past, finally occupying the same space again. I spent 17 years running away from what I felt that night. We sit on my couch, the same gray fabric that felt so ordinary this morning now charged with significance. Julian turns to face me, and in the lamp's soft light, I can see the teenager he used to be overlaying the man he's become. The same dark eyes, the same slightly crooked smile, but now marked by years of compromise and careful choices. Nathaniel, he says, and my name in his voice sounds like a prayer. I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen without interrupting, okay? I nod, though my heart is already racing with anticipation and dread. When I got married, I thought I was doing the right thing. Emma is a good woman, a wonderful mother. She loves me, and I care about her deeply. We have a life together that works, that makes sense to everyone around us. He pauses, runs his hands through his hair in a gesture I remember from high school, a tell that meant he was struggling with something difficult. But I've never felt with her what I felt with you that night in your bedroom. Not once in 12 years of marriage have I felt that sense of rightness, of coming home. And I've tried, Nathaniel. I've tried so hard to feel it, because it would make everything so much easier. The admission hangs between us like a lit fuse. I want to reach for him, to close the distance that's existed between us for so long. But something in his expression stops me. I leave tomorrow, he continues. Sunday evening flight back to Chicago. Emma thinks I'm here for a high school friend's funeral, which isn't entirely a lie. The boy I used to be did die here, didn't he? The boy who knew what he wanted, but was too afraid to take it. His words are like a countdown clock, marking the finite nature of this moment. Whatever happens between us now will have to sustain us for another 17 years, or for the rest of our lives. I have to ask you something, he says, and his voice is steady but his hands are shaking. What if we stopped running? What if, just for tonight, we let ourselves have what we wanted when we were 17? The question pierces through me like lightning. I've imagined this moment thousands of times over the years, but now that it's here, I'm paralyzed by the magnitude of choice it represents. To say yes would be to step across a line I've never crossed, to claim something I've wanted desperately, but convinced myself I could never have. But it would also be to become complicit in the destruction of his family, to transform our beautiful memory into something built on betrayal and lies. Julian reads the conflict in my face, and his expression grows gentle. I'm not asking you to fix my life, he says softly. I'm not asking you to save me from the choices I've made. I'm just asking for one night to remember what it felt like to be honest about what I wanted. He reaches for my hand, the first time he's touched me since that brief contact across the table at Murphy's. His fingers are warm, familiar, as if no time has passed since we were teenagers learning the weight of longing. We don't have to do anything more than we did that night, he says. I just want to hold you again. I want to remember what it felt like to be held by someone who understood me completely. The temptation is overwhelming. To let him pull me close, to rest my head against his shoulder the way I've dreamed of doing for 17 years, to feel his arms around me and pretend, just for a few hours, that we're still young enough for love to conquer everything. But as I look into his eyes, I see not just the boy I fell in love with, but the man he's become. A man with responsibilities, with people who depend on him, with a life he's built on compromises I can't ask him to abandon for one night of honesty. And I realize that loving him means protecting not just what we were, but what we've each become in the years since. Julian, I say, and his name tastes like tears and possibility and loss all at once. If we do this, if we cross this line, it will change what that night meant. It will make it about what we're taking now instead of what we gave each other then. He starts to protest, but I continue, the words coming from some deep place of wisdom I didn't know I possessed. What happened between us when we were 17 was perfect because it was pure. It was about love before we learned to complicate it with guilt and betrayal and consequences. If we hold each other now, as married men stealing time from lives that belong to other people, we'll poison that memory. His face crumples slightly, and I see that he understands what I'm saying even as he fights against it. Sometimes, I tell him, love survives by staying untouched. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is preserve what was beautiful instead of trying to recreate it in circumstances that will only diminish it. We sit in my living room, our hands still connected, both of us crying quietly for the boys we were and the men we've become. Outside, the October night grows deeper, carrying us closer to the moment when he'll have to leave, when we'll have to return to the separate lives we've built in the absence of each other. But for now, we sit together in the space between wanting and having, between memory and possibility, learning that sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to let go. Julian stays until just after midnight. We spend the remaining hours talking quietly about everything except what we can't have, his children's personalities, my students' latest essays, the books we've been reading, the small details that fill the spaces between the large moments of a life. It feels like the conversations we might have had if we'd been allowed to grow into friendship instead of carrying the weight of unspoken love. When he finally stands to leave, we both know this is goodbye in a way that goes deeper than temporary parting. He pauses at my door, turns back to look at me with eyes that hold everything we've shared and everything we're choosing to leave unsaid. "Thank you," he says, and I know he's not just thanking me for the evening or for listening to his confessions. He's thanking me for the choice I made, for loving him enough to preserve what was beautiful instead of trying to possess it. "Thank you too," I tell him, because his honesty has given me something I didn't know I needed. The knowledge that what I felt was real, was shared, was worthy of the 17 years I spent carrying it like a secret flame. He reaches for the door handle, then stops. "The note," he says. "Will you keep it?" "Always." He nods once, steps into the hallway, and walks away without looking back. I listen to his footsteps descending the stairs, hear the building's front door close with quiet finality. Then I'm alone again, but it's a different kind of alone than it was 12 hours ago. I walk to my window and watch him get into his rental car, a practical sedan that suits the practical life he's built. He sits for a long moment before starting the engine, and though I can't see his face from this distance, I imagine he's looking up at my window, memorizing the sight of this building where we finally told each other the truth. When he drives away, his taillights disappearing around the corner, I feel the absence like a physical thing. But it's not the hollow ache I've carried for 17 years. It's something cleaner, more complete, the sadness of ending rather than the frustration of never beginning. I return to my coffee table where our artifacts still rest side by side. His note and our photograph, two pieces of evidence that what happened between us mattered. I pick up the photograph and study our 17-year-old faces again, but now I see them differently. Not as a record of something lost, but as proof of something found. We discovered love before we learned to be afraid of it, and that discovery shaped us into the men we became, even if we couldn't be those men together. For the first time in years, I don't hide the photograph when I'm finished looking at it. Instead, I place it on my bookshelf, next to the poetry collection, where it can exist openly as part of my story rather than as a secret shame. The boy in that picture loved boldly, if briefly, and he deserves to be remembered without apology. I pull out my phone and look at Julian's original message, still unanswered after all these days. "Do you remember that night?" My fingers hover over the keyboard, no longer trembling, no longer uncertain about how to respond. "Yes," I type. "I remember." And then, after a pause, "Thank you for remembering too." I send the message knowing he won't see it until tomorrow, when he's back in Chicago with his family, returning to the rhythms of his chosen life. But that's appropriate somehow. This conversation needed to happen outside of time, in the space between past and future where love exists in its purest form. Sunday morning arrives gray and quiet. I make coffee, sit at my kitchen table with papers to grade, and find myself thinking not about Julian, but about my students. About the 17-year-olds in my classroom who are just beginning to discover who they are and what they want. Some of them, I know, are struggling with questions about identity and desire, carrying secrets they're not sure they're allowed to speak. Tomorrow, I decide, I'll be a little braver in how I approach their essays about courage and authenticity. I'll ask better questions, create safer spaces, remember that the most important thing I can teach them isn't grammar or literary analysis, but the possibility that their truths, whatever they are, deserve to be heard. The weekend passes peacefully. I visit my parents on Sunday, endure the familiar questions about my social life. But this time my answers feel less like defensive maneuvers and more like simple statements of fact. I am single. I am content. I am living a life that makes sense to me even if it doesn't match their expectations. Monday evening, back in my apartment, I realize something has shifted in the quality of my solitude. The walls don't press quite so close. The silence doesn't feel quite so heavy. I'm still alone, but I'm no longer waiting. Not for Julian to return, not for permission to want what I want, not for some impossible future to justify the choices I've made. I am 34 years old, and I am finally at peace with being exactly who I am. A man who loved deeply and chose wisely, who carries beautiful memories without being crushed by them, who learned that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is let something precious remain precious by leaving it untouched. In the soft glow of my reading lamp, surrounded by the books and photographs that tell the story of my life, I understand that wholeness doesn't require having everything you've ever wanted. Sometimes it simply requires knowing that you were brave enough to want it, wise enough to honor it, and strong enough to let it be what it was rather than demanding it become something else. The story of Julian and me isn't a tragedy because we didn't end up together. It's a love story because we loved each other well enough to preserve what was beautiful between us, even when that preservation required sacrifice. Some loves are meant to change your life. Others are meant to save it. Ours, I realize now, did both.